right, so we're going to have a great panel. It's always good when you have your boss in the front row watching you, so this is exciting. So we're going to be talking about how do you attach the hard technical work that we're all doing on a day-to-day basis to how you're being seen as an efficient arm to control risk. And what better way to do that than to have folks who are leaders in companies, on boards, responsible for governance, responsible for oversight, those that are making decisions around where money is spent, obviously is critical as well. And so with that, maybe if we'll just get a few initial thoughts before we get into the questions from each of you, just like for a moment, just reflect. And if you could say, what are the 2 or 3 main things that you think about when considering risk in an organization?
Start with me?
Yeah.
Thanks, and thanks for inviting me. It's just great to see all the people, and Qualys has just been a great supporter of CSA since our beginning. So it certainly has been, I think, like we've grown beyond the cybersecurity being a portion of IT risk, that like we understand this is overall enterprise risk, financial, operational, and so I think we've made progress there. I think there's translation that we got to work on the communication on this. I think that financial services does this like much better, and I think that's always sort of a good group. If you're not in financial services, go talk to your colleagues there about how they do it and how they've institutionalized it. And one thing a CISO has told me recently, I just thought I'd throw out, is really helped him when he was invited to be on a board for, it was a small local organization, but just understanding that cadence. And so having cybersecurity people actually understand the boards inside and out really helped there. So just some initial thoughts.
Okay.
Yeah, I echo what Jim is saying. I mean, we've really gone from this being a technology concern to being a business issue, and we need to be able to frame the conversation not from just the technology perspective, but from the business impact perspective. So when you look at ROCon and the ability to translate the technology concerns into business issues, it's helpful for the stakeholders to understand how to make decisions and how to assess the impacts.
So I'm on, just full disclosure, I'm on the board of Qualys. I'm also the chair of the audit committee. And so every quarter I get to interrogate Jonathan about his cybersecurity metrics. And I get to interrogate the CFO about how much they're spending. And so one of the challenges that I see is, and I've often joked about this with people, is that the 2 hardest areas to quantify spending, in my opinion, are marketing spend and cybersecurity spend. The old joke about you're probably spending double what you need to, but you don't know which half is the problem. And so I think the challenge from a board perspective is when there's been an incident in the industry, CrowdStrike being a good example, all of a sudden there's another vector that you need to talk to the CISOs about how are we going to make the investments we need to make sure that that sort of thing doesn't happen to us. It always feels quite reactive, and it also feels like the dollars are being scattershotted across the organization. And so trying to sort through all that, Jonathan, and figure out where we can make a difference with some incremental spend is really important to a board.
That's great. That's great. So the other question I have for the panel here is, so if you think about it, you've all seen probably a lot of metrics before as you're kind of going through the decisions you have to make. What in your mind makes a good metric, that someone has presented to you where you think, what, this really helps me understand the risk for just cybersecurity? Obviously, that you have a whole enterprise risk management function, but just for cybersecurity, and I would throw in that as well, resilience to me is a component of cybersecurity. But is there a metric that you've seen that just like that really resonated with you? So, other than enterprise true risk scores, obviously, but that one as well, yeah.
Absolutely. So I do see like this sort of movement more towards, maybe you're using Fair Institute or something else like that. You're trying to take like your security program and quantify the different financial like consequences of different areas, but you know, you can do things like hey, we've reduced phishing attacks through this program. They haven't been successful. We haven't had like any successful ransomware attacks, and those sorts of things you can measure them. You've got the data stream that you can go do that, and there are some good sort of metrics on what those cost on average. So you are able to calculate, yeah, we probably saved you X amount of money through these programs that reduced this from whatever, 5% of those things being clicked to 1% of those being clicked.
Okay.
Yeah, when I looked at where we would spend money as a company in terms of our cyber risk investments, understanding what's the value that we're protecting and what's the cost against that, instead of just the sky will fall down and the earth will be obliterated. It's hard to react to that. The speaker this morning talked about the buildings on fire. Being able to quantify where the risk is, what the dollar exposure is, and what the cost to mitigate that is the more productive conversation to have with the finance department in terms of allocating the budget, and then also communicating that conversation to the board and the financial sponsors.
I think it's also useful to kind of understand what your comparable companies are doing. One of the things that's always a bit of a challenge is sizing the overall spending envelope. There's also putting it to work, as Mark said, in the right places. But, how much should we be spending, and how are other companies looking at this? It's hard for CISOs, in my opinion, to get me a lot of comparable information. But one of the things that boards often do is we have our own board events, and I go to the software audit committee meetings in the Bay Area, and we all ask these questions. How much are you spending? Where are you spending it? What kind of things have you learned? And so, to the degree that you're able to provide some comparable information, and especially if it's a little bit more granular so that it can be digested by a board, be very helpful. Otherwise, they're going to go form their opinion someplace else, and they're going to come back and say, you're spending way too much, or maybe you're not spending enough. And so it's important, I think, you understand the dynamics of your industry.
That's great. And of course, we now have the questions up here. I tend to go a little off script, but we'll get back on. But just on that, like one of the things that I think is amazing that we don't talk about enough as a security community, this has always kind of baffled me. I sort of get it, but oftentimes when CISOs talk, they say, what percentage of IT budget do I get? And I think it's the flip of that, which is how efficient am I in my role to drive down risk? But we never talk about efficiency oftentimes in security. I feel like it's always this idea of, well, listen, I can't do what I need to do because I don't get 10% of the budget, or if I'm in financial services, they get 15, 18%. And to me, I'm just curious, obviously in your roles, you're thinking about efficiency of the organization. How efficient are we at spending? How do you think about that? Like really, are you pushing organizations to really show how efficient they are at operating kind of their risk appetite?
Yeah, I would say that the financial counterparts that I see on boards, I tend that they take the sort of, hey, industry standard for the spend is just something that kind of goes out the door, and it's like more of a zero-based budgeting, especially with the technology changing so much and the environment being so dynamic. You've got to go zero-based, and you've got to explain like what is the threat environment today. Do you need to invest more today? There's sort of the CapEx portion of we've got to transform security, and then the operational portion of it. So I don't see that as happening. And I think like zero-based, and I've had CISOs tell me that they don't like it, but sometimes a down economy is really a great opportunity to look at what are we doing with what we have, and what are the challenges ahead of us, and where do we see the threat environment going?
Yeah, I think that change environment is also the reason the zero-based approach, I think, is the one largely taken, because what do you need to throw out? what things are you doing that are no longer effective or efficient or cost effective, and those dollars should be reallocated someplace else. So instead of kind of, business as usual plus, it's like, let's look at it from the bottom up and make sure that every dollar we're spending is going to, the most productive places.
That's great.
And I just wanted to follow on one thing that Tom said, which I think, he kind of mentioned, which I think is important, is when you look at like CISOs communicating with the board and sponsors, cybersecurity is a cross-business issue everywhere. And so these people are now very educated on this topic and actually bring a perspective across more than one organization, so they can actually be useful partners in terms of understanding and quantifying some of those metric norms.
Yeah, I agree. I think the thing that you have to think about, and this is the CFO and me talking now, is that your plan is generally fixed for the year with your investors, right? So when you go into a year, there's going to be surprises. And where do you want to concentrate additional dollars? You want to put it into revenue-producing activities for the most part. If you add more dollars to IT or security, it doesn't grow the top line. And look, all of us get paid by growing our businesses, right? So, you have to take the broad perspective when you're looking at spending and think, okay, I need to make sure I risk manage, obviously. But what can I do to run this efficiently so that I can contribute some of those dollars back to revenue-producing activities? That really is something that the board loves to hear, and it almost never happens. Jonathan is actually quite good at this because he runs a very tight ship with a relatively small envelope versus some of the other companies I've been involved with. And he has a good rapport with the CFO as a result. But it's also important that, you're still risk managing, right? And so he has to spend his dollars wisely to ensure that there's not going to be a blow up, especially at a security company, right? But to Mark's point, there's more productive uses for the cash than putting it into security. It's a necessary evil and an important one, but, let's grow the top line.
Yeah, such great points. And I think, it really does. I feel like as hopefully a good CISO, I guess it'll depend. But I do feel like the more you go into enterprise risk management, because obviously, as well, working with, our CFO, working with others, there's multiple risks, right? There's risks related to engineering, product, sales related, and you're trying to manage all of that. And I think if you don't have that perspective, you're kind of missing components, right? Because there are trade-offs, right? Where you're going to have to, think about rainy day, and if something goes wrong, we have a little extra money to cover, those contingencies. And I always appreciate how the board too, I think very important, it's a two-way street. Like, because you serve on multiple entities and groups, you can bring a perspective that's super valuable. So really appreciate all that. Yeah, so let's talk about, since we're building an AI ROC, so let's look at the other side of the AI, which is, oh my gosh, AI is going to ruin the world, right? And I'm sure people in this organization either hear from your families, probably coworkers, maybe executives who are saying, hey, pump the brakes on AI, too dangerous, too much risk, we're not going to do it. So I'm just curious, obviously, are you experiencing that? And if you are, how do you think about taking in the risk of AI, and governing that?
So I think every organization in the world right now has their head spinning looking at the duality, the multiple aspects of this. The CEOs are saying, how do we take advantage of this to separate ourselves from our competitors, go into new markets, be more efficient? Then there's what are the new attacks that we're going to see from this? And then like what I saw today from Sumedh is like, how are we using agentic AI to actually transform how we do cybersecurity, which we have to fight good AI with bad AI. So what's really important for CISOs is not to get sucked into the hype around AI to say it's the greatest thing ever, or it hallucinates, it's terrible, it's the end of the world. We got to be right down the middle in our perspectives of this. And in fact, I think we need to be the most knowledgeable people about AI in the company to advise the board, because if you talk about the scientists who invent this stuff, and they get surprised by these emergent behaviors. Oh, I didn't know it was going to be able to do that. If they don't know, then it's really up to us to help manage the risks and say, well, if attacks increase at this level, if the sophistication of phishing attacks, deepfakes, all that, how do we go counteract that? Oh, if the business really wants to move and use Cursor to increase the products by 10x, then okay, how do we manage those sorts of things? That we got to be right down the middle. Don't think it's the best thing ever. Don't think it's the worst thing ever, and help the company manage the risks in that way.
Thoughts?
I remember, I'm old enough to remember when economists in the 90s wrote that you can see computers everywhere except in the productivity statistics. And in those days, computers were being used for relatively low-value activities, but as time marched on, they became higher and higher value-oriented. Then the internet came along, and nobody wanted to put their businesses on the web because that's dangerous and was going to cause problems. But then it became a lot of high-value activities, including a lot of sales functions, and so companies migrated. I think AI is going to be the same way. You know, today it's still relatively low-value stuff. Some people would argue differently, but I think it's going to become high-value pretty quickly, and companies are going to have to adopt. And it scares the heck out of me as an audit chair committee member because, you know, it's going to be another place where data leaks out of the enterprise and into the public domain. And if that happens, then, you know, we get all the data rights and privacy issues that we already have today, but it's just amplified. So security is going to be very important in this environment, and I think it's going to be a situation where budgets aren't going to get materially larger, so you're going to need to switch to kind of higher value security products and make sure that you're spending your dollars wisely to kind of cover that AI risk while not giving up the core things that have to be done in the back office.
Great. Yeah, and I think, you know, I'll tell you, there's a lot of funny stuff going on with AI, right? You know, a security consultant, I was telling some people, was online. You know, LinkedIn can be pretty funny to watch sometimes. And so the person said, you know, I think we're at the point where all CISOs are going to prohibit the use of AI in companies because there's so much risk. And someone commented immediately and said, well, you won't have to worry about it because all those companies will be out of business.
Yeah.
And I think that is the dynamic, though, that we're seeing with AI. And the good news is, too, I would say, we went through this with the cloud.
Yep.
I can still remember trying to convince people to use the cloud, and people were very passionate back in the day about that. Over my dead body will, you know, and even, you know, being the CISO of Qualys, like, you're crazy, we're not going to deliver a security solution from the cloud. I mean, people were so, I mean, you remember, people were so upset and passionate, but now it's how we do business, you know, and I think, like you've all said, I really do believe CISOs can lead the way on AI, right? Because it's so critical to a business, you know, instead of being that blocker of advancement. You know, hopefully the question is, how do we do, you know, responsible use of AI, right? And then now, what is the metric to govern that? Haven't quite figured that one out, but what a great topic. So the one last thing I guess I'd love to leave us with is, you think about the balance between compliance and risk, you know, and at least as I think about it, you know, you have compliance. That doesn't necessarily mean you've reduced all risk. And there's risk associated with not being compliant.
A lot of risk.
You know, and so I know as I'm trying to balance my security budget and spend, and again, I could spend a lot more on compliance. I definitely could, and I get pushed at times to do that with other, you know, regulations or third-party frameworks. But is that going to make us, you know, more secure? Will that actually reduce risk? I guess how, you know, when I'm presenting on topics like that, you know, to the board, what are you thinking along those lines?
I certainly think compliance is there for a reason, and if we don't have the guardrails, then who knows what organizations are going to do. But I certainly see a great amount of wariness with the idea that like GRC, which is supposed to like merge these and say compliance actually is there to reduce risk, that there's a wariness in like what has been delivered by that promise and a wariness with the traditional sorts of audits. And so you hear more and more about GRC engineering and like let's actually turn compliance into more of an engineering sort of capability and an approach to it. So we need to have those guardrails, but I think with technology, with the ability of like AI, for example, to take, if you're a large financial institution and you've got 1,000 different regulations from every region in the world, to actually be able to map those together more automatically and reduce what you need to do. That's kind of where we need to go. I think we're regulators are going to regulate. That's going to be the reality forever. But if we can take that sort of approach, I think that's where we're going to turn this into a more manageable and still reduce risk, but be less of a burden on their budgets.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's basic hygiene stuff for compliance, right, that we just absolutely have to do. There's no choice, whether it's to support audits or regulatory frameworks or SOC compliance. But then, you know, there's these other frameworks that kind of go to the next level. I think we need to take that with a grain of salt because they may not be keeping up with where the industry is and what you need to be looking at. So a more proactive view in terms of where to invest on that next level of stuff once you have the kind of the basic hygiene in place makes sense.
I kind of feel like compliance follows risk. So when a new risk is identified and people get burned, guess what? Compliance follows, right? And so now you get to fill out, you know, these compliance forms for the rest of your life because of that incident. But it doesn't protect against any new incidents or new risks. And so I feel like you need to really focus your attention on that part of the equation and treat compliance as sort of a necessary evil that you have to do. But if you do things right, and you know, I think this is where AI can really have an opportunity, maybe you really can use that to turn over compliance to the AI and really focus on the high value side of it and making sure that you're getting in front of new risks that are coming along. That's really what we worry about in the audit committee is, yeah, it's great that Jonathan reports these statistics on things that, you know, line up with past bad actors that have done things, you know, and I think we're now getting to the point where we're probably no longer going to be wiring money out from our Treasury Department to people that send us, you know, invoices that don't make sense. Hopefully, sorry if anyone's been affected by that, and maybe therefore, you know, the dollars that you might have spent on trying to protect those sorts of things, you can settle down on that, treat it as a compliance activity, and really focus on the risk management.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, no, really good perspective. So I lied. I'm going to finish with one last question, and this is probably, and it's not on here. So you ready? Okay, I'm going to throw one out here for you. Which group? It's a quiz. Which group is more risk adverse? CFOs, board members, or CISOs? More risk adverse as a group.
Let's flip the order.
Wow. Yeah.
He's all of those. So.
I mean, look, I think when you're on an audit committee, you're pretty risk averse because that's where the buck kind of stops in a way, right? I mean, you're responsible for what management does, right? I mean, you're paying management, you're setting the goals for management, you're tracking the performance, and you know, you're trying to avoid having the company run into a huge issue. So I think we're pretty risk averse.
Yeah.
In my experience, CISOs can run the gamut. And some are, you know, super risk averse and are actually not very helpful business executives.
Yeah.
But the more practical CISO has a balanced view of risk, and the CFOs really don't know what the heck they're doing. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, I mean, I think in this, no offense, I think a lot of CISOs have multiple personality disorder. So they will play this persona of being like very risk adverse when they feel like the organization is not paying attention to the important risks. But actually, their role is to actually, again, sort of being in that middle and say, what does the business want to do? Let's help us do that. So it's at the end of the day, it's the people writing the checks that are like the most risk averse. It's like, you know, hard to like argue with what they do there. And as you see, like third-party risk and all these different areas, well, new things that come up, you know, they tend to say, okay, we're getting a new business partner. I'm gonna be nervous about that. Like, go tell me why.
Yeah, I like it. Am I supposed to answer that one too, or?
Yeah.
Give it a shot.
Yeah, listen, I think, you know, in the past, and at times where I would struggle is where, you know, security teams were so, no, we're not going to do this. We're never going to do this. You know, and there are times where I've got to say, like, stop saying no. Start saying, how are we going to manage the risk if executives want to go down this path, right? Because at the end of the day, right, it's whatever sales team, engineering that have to, you know, make the company run, right, and bring in income and do that. And so I would say historically, you know, unfortunately, there was a lot of just, you know, no, too risky. We're never going to do this. Don't do it. But I'm hoping that we, with this conference and also I think some of the advancements where CISOs want to be more business aligned, and sometimes that's just talk. But really, if you want to be business aligned, then instead of starting from zero up, in my mind, like with my budget, I would actually wait till I got the budget from my HR officer, from my executive, and then I'd say, what is it going to take for me to make this possible and manage the risk? You know, and I think until we flip that context, we're still a pretty risk-averse group, but thank you. I think this was great. Really appreciate your perspectives. Obviously, all the insight and wisdom I get every day, you know, from Tom and obviously meeting you. It's been great. So thank you, and I think we're breaking for lunch. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
That was great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan, Tom, Jim, and Mark, for this insightful conversation.